Yeah, this is never gonna get old, Uzi said as she pulled herself up from the elevator shaft that served as the entrance to her hideout. She meant it as well. She didn't think the swell of pride she felt every time she laid eyes on the place would ever go away. It had taken 3 days of using her natural worker drone abilities to lift, push, and drag things from one place to another, which made her gag every time she thought about it, but in the end it was everything she wanted. It had started with wanting a higher vantage point to observe the murder drone, as he seemed to spend most of any given night flying around the ruins of the city. Of course that would sound incredibly stupid to the lay drone, but it was actually brilliant, because it was stupid. Murder drones were accustomed to looking down for their prey. They'd never even think to look for victims on the collapsed 4th floor of a barely standing office building. Even if they flew right by it, her blind, made of believably piled office furniture, carefully placed chunks of concrete, and strategically bent rebar would keep her hidden when combined with her dark attire and dimmed stealth mode screen. You know, as long as they didn't look too closely, in which case Uzi's homemade flashbang grenades, escape rope, and rigged explosives came into play. If you're gonna do something stupid, be smart about it, she thought with a self-assured smirk as she took a seat in her swivel chair and grabbed a pair of binoculars and a notebook from her backpack. Yes, Uzi was feeling herself that much. And why shouldn't she? She had survived a direct attack from a starving murder drone. She had been observing, another one for 2 weeks and hadn't even been spotted. Then she walked into enemy territory and made a freaking clubhouse, observation tower, entirely unopposed. Sure, there had been a few close calls and moments that left her shaken for days afterward, but overall, main character status confirmed. That said, thanks to her reckless and foolhardy actions, her notebook was a treasure trove of oil sucker data, and she hoped tonight would add a few more paragraphs. "Where are you tonight, murder boy?" Uzi muttered. The skies were empty, so she checked the spire, cranking the zoom as high as it would go to make out any details. No killbot, but there was something down there that made her do a double take. Propped up against the car where she'd met him, miraculously still in one piece, was her railgun. It was the most obvious trap in the world, and she absolutely hated that it was going to work. "I can't just leave it there," Uzi hissed to herself. Sure, she definitely could make another one, but finding the materials would be even more of a pain in the ass than the first time. So, if she didn't have to... Flashbang in hand, Uzi cautiously peeked around the corner of the last major structure between her and the spire. Yep, that was her railgun all right. Just sitting there. Menacingly. Whatever, she thought with a scoff. Made it this far, no wimping out now. With her screen briefly flashing Mission Impossible.mp3, she made her move. It wasn't far. Her walks from home to school were longer. But she didn't walk to school across open ground, in the dead of night, with a living nightmare almost certainly lurking nearby. I mean, there's Lizzie and her goons, but I can take them, Uzi thought as she paused behind a car just across the street from her objective. It was then that she noticed what looked like a piece of paper duct taped to the side of it. That wasn't there before. With a sinking feeling in her gut, she broke cover and crouch-walked up to the weapon, and sure enough, there was a note attached to it. The handwriting was surprisingly messy, but she had no trouble reading it. "You should take better care of this. You might need it one day." Uzi picked the railgun up and gave it a quick inspection. There wasn't any damage she could see, though getting tossed around and being exposed to the elements for so long certainly wasn't good for it. She flipped the switch, with some hesitation, ready to toss it and take cover at the slightest hint of red. But she breathed a sigh of relief when it powered on with nothing more than the soft whine of a generic sci-fi weapon, and moved to sling it across her back. But a thought crossed her mind that made her freeze in place. I know the note wasn't there before. He put it there between me seeing the gun and going for it. How the hell did he know? Uzi looked back towards her hideout, then turned on the railgun's holosight to use as a telescope. There he was, in her chair, looking directly at her through the binoculars she'd left behind. Seeing that he'd been made, he flashed a shining grin and waved at her. A flash of panic shot through her when she remembered that she'd also left her notebook up there, right next to the binoculars, so there was no way he hadn't seen it already. But as quick as it came, it was gone and replaced by something Uzi had only felt a few times in her life. Resignation. He played her like a synth and she walked right into it. She was used to dealing with drones who barely had the processing power to walk and blink at the same time. But she thought of him as just a couple of steps above that. Smart, but not Uzi smart. Huh, so this is what it feels like on the other side, she pondered. Honestly, not all that bad. Everyone else is just a bunch of babies. Accepting her defeat this time, Uzi slung the railgun across her back, looked at her hideout, and gave a two-finger salute to her first worthy opponent. He, N, had won this battle, but she would be back to even the score soon enough. Playing with fire, N, the disassembly drone sighed to himself as he watched the purple worker walk away towards the bunker. You are playing with fire. The girl was a growing problem. He knew that. And yet, it was like he couldn't help but make it worse. From the moment he'd laid eyes on her, he knew he'd found something he didn't even know he was looking for. She was fiery and determined on a level N hadn't seen in even the most defiant workers before. She was exceedingly clever, amazingly resourceful, and where others gave in to fear the moment things looked bleak, she responded with aggression. Perhaps not exactly leader material, but definitely the type to start a revolution by proving it could be done. She was a spark that he didn't want to see snuffed out before it got the chance to light a fire. So, saving her from V was a no-brainer, as was letting her go home afterwards. However, the idea was to scare her enough to maintain a healthy fear of him and his kind, but not enough to make her fight seem totally hopeless. It seemed to have worked the first night, despite the whole open-mouth insert fist incident. But 3 days later, he saw her again, and this time not scavenging for parts, but watching the skies. He let it, and her, go once again, only to find her again 2 more days later, very obviously trying to follow him from the ground. On that night, he practically buzzed her, flying low through the street right over her head, then landing on a streetlight and making a show of looking around. He could practically hear her chassis rattling before he took to the air again, leaving her to run back home on shaky legs. N admired her tenacity, but thought for sure the lesson would stick. It did not. Literally the next night, he came across a scavenging party that had, according to his eavesdropping, gone out a bit too late, found a good hole, and spent a bit too much time debating over what to bring back. And as the workers argued, far too loudly for where they were, guess who emerged as the voice of common sense, telling them to just mark the location and send a second team for the rest in the morning. As funny as it was to watch the other drones sheepishly acknowledge their own idiocy, it was time for another lesson. It sucked that it had to be at someone else's expense, but even though he wasn't down for genocide anymore, the drone still had to drink. That said, it was one of his coolest moments. He timed it perfectly. The party was heading back. One of the workers broke off from the group for something, and Uzi, knowing what lurked in the dark, tried to cover him with a crossbow that looked like it could pack a wallop. She took her eyes off of him for literally 2 seconds, and that was enough. N shot out from a dark alley and tackled the unfortunate worker into another, cleanly severing his head with a single claw before he could scream, and melting into the shadows with his kill. He stayed to watch just long enough to see Uzi realize what had happened, and hopefully think about how easily it could have been her. It took her 3 days to come back from that one, and when she did, N found her building the very fort he was now sitting in. He knew she had gotten far too comfortable, bordering on disrespectful, and was perhaps in need of a more painful reality check. A good chase, ending in a bad mauling. Puncture something non-vital, take a couple of sips, do a little surface damage, that kind of thing. Then, let her get her licks in and make a miraculous escape. Simple. It would suck to hurt her like that, but it would be for her own good. Everyone's good, actually. So why did he not only let the game continue, but out himself as an active player? Maybe he liked being the one holding all the cards for once. Maybe he liked playing the role of the cool, aloof anti-hero. Maybe he liked being the object of someone's fascination instead of everyone's scorn. Maybe he literally couldn't remember the last positive interaction he'd had with anyone, and didn't want the game to end, because maybe the game was his only reprieve from the anger, the sadness, the guilt, the fear, the loneliness. A sudden crunching noise snapped N out of his funk, and he winced at the crushed binoculars in his hand. Oh, biscuits.